The sound of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. All eyes turned to the black man standing before the bench. A cold voice rang out. "You're late. This is a court of law, not some place you can saunter into whenever you please." A hefty fine was declared. But something in the judge's tone made the atmosphere heavier. There was something off. He didn't know who Ethan Robinson was. He just saw a black man in a suit walking in late, disregarding the reason. But then, in a moment, the truth was revealed, and the entire courtroom held its breath. When power is challenged, who will prevail? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Comment your city or country below. And don't forget to hit subscribe to catch more dramatic and inspiring stories. The story begins. The clock struck 8:42 a.m. as Ethan Robinson parked his car in the lot outside the city courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The warm morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Ethan let out a deep sigh. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparation, but today, life had thrown him a curveball. This morning wasn't supposed to be complicated. The task at hand was a mere formality, to contest an error in the property tax assessment on his grandmother's inherited house. The city had inexplicably increased the taxes, and Ethan had spent weeks gathering evidence to prove it was a mistake. The house was more than just property to him. It was the bedrock of his childhood, where he learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Ethan looked every bit the seasoned attorney, even if his morning had been anything but smooth. An urgent call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Ethan couldn't ignore it. He reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court, knowing he was racing against time. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed a text from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. "The judge in Greenville is notoriously strict about tardiness. Be careful." Ethan sighed, slipping his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. The truth was his weapon, and he was fully equipped with evidence. But something about the text lingered. He brushed it off as he stepped inside the cool courthouse. The city courthouse was nothing like the federal courthouses where Ethan spent most of his time. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People streamed in and out, clutching stacks of documents, their faces etched with the anxieties of parking tickets, petty disputes, and other minor grievances. Ethan checked his watch, 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Just enough time to find the right courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people engaged in hushed conversations. Courtroom 204. Judge Richard Whitman was etched in brass on the door. Ethan straightened his tie and entered. The courtroom was already packed. He found a seat near the back and sat down, opening his briefcase to review his evidence. As he skimmed his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Richard Whitman, a tall man with stark white hair and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without uttering a word. His reputation for being unyielding was evident in the way he scanned the room, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood. Ethan rose, his posture erect, as the judge took his seat. Ethan noted the absolute silence that followed. Judge Whitman began calling cases with mechanical efficiency, his tone sharp and detached. Ethan observed closely. A middle-aged man in a suit slipped in a few minutes late. Moments later, a middle-aged man in a suit sneaked into the room, unnoticed. Then a young woman in casual attire slid in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Ethan made a mental note, but focused on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Ethan heard his name called. He gathered his files and approached the bench, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he stepped forward, Judge Whitman looked up, his expression hardening. Ethan sensed a shift in the room, a silent tension that had been absent in the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think this court's time is less valuable than yours?" Ethan raised a hand slightly, palm outward, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was handling urgent federal matters." The judge interrupted him. "Excuses don't justify tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't abide by that, I suggest you reconsider your priorities." Ethan felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of punctuality. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax assessment." Judge Whitman waved a dismissive hand. "We'll get to that later. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You're fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, whispers rippled through the room. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his tone calm and measured, "may I offer an explanation?" The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about being late. It was about something deeper, something many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Ethan wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, Ethan opened his briefcase, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began to take notes, his pen moving rapidly across the page. Meanwhile, the judge continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Ethan knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary morning. Ethan sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom continued its rhythm, but Ethan couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Whitman imposed the $750 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to the other latecomers. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling through her phone, unremarked. A man in a gray coat, currently presenting his case, had clearly entered after the judge began, yet the gavel's wrath was reserved solely for Ethan. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern, one Ethan recognized as clearly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine of that magnitude for a minor tardiness in a city court was exceptionally steep, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of skepticism, unease, and curiosity. Ethan could tell others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak up. "Next case," Judge Whitman announced. Ethan's name echoed through the room. He rose, his walk calm and deliberate as he returned to the bench. The judge regarded him with a sharp look, as if daring him to falter. Ethan began, "Your Honor, I have here the documents pertaining to the erroneous property tax assessment. This property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments are inconsistent with the city's assessed value." He placed the folder on the bench, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photos. He pointed to a specific page. "This is the initial tax assessment, which has been consistent for 5 years. However, the new adjustment reflects a 30% increase without proper notice or explanation." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. "I will review it at the appropriate time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court?" Ethan's composure remained intact. "Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. My tardiness was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained unwavering. Your priorities, however noble, do not justify breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Ethan, but the unspoken dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional accomplishments, his character, even his attempt to respect the system, all seemed to carry no weight in this room. Ethan took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules being applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease spread through the room. The judge stiffened, his face reddening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? I'm asking for clarity, Ethan replied, his tone even. It's important to ensure fairness is upheld, not just for myself but for everyone here. The judge's gavel struck sharply. I will not tolerate insinuations against this court. Your fine stands. Ethan inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's gaze on him. He could sense the silent admiration of some and the apprehension of others. This wasn't the first time Ethan had encountered bias cloaked in authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan pulled out his phone, discreetly typing notes. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He made a silent decision right then and there: this situation would not end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Ethan's presence had changed the atmosphere. Others noticed it too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, giving Ethan a brief, knowing look. The court clerk, her fingers flying across the keyboard, paused occasionally, her unease palpable. As the session concluded, Ethan lingered for a moment as people filed out. He watched as they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression a mix of astonishment and determination. Ethan left the courtroom, briefcase in hand, his thoughts coalescing into a plan. This was no longer about the property tax assessment, or even the fine. It was about something far greater, something he couldn't ignore. As Ethan stepped out of the courtroom, the fresh air outside offered no respite from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse bustled with the mundane movements of daily proceedings, but in Ethan's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over his U.S. Attorney Assistant's contact. No, he murmured to himself, not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't random. It was structural. Ethan's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back at his car, Ethan opened his briefcase, retrieving his badge and credentials. The gold-embossed symbol of a federal prosecutor caught the sunlight streaming through the windshield. He decided this would be the first step. When he re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning's cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers lingered, shuffling papers or waiting their turn. Judge Whitman was flipping through documents, his demeanor calm but clearly fatigued. Ethan walked confidently toward the bench, badge and credentials in hand. As he approached the bench, the court clerk looked up, her fingers halting mid-keystroke. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. Mr. Robinson, the court is no longer in session. If you have further business, you need to schedule an appointment, the judge said curtly. Your Honor. Ethan began, his voice carrying a quiet authority. I believe it's important to formally introduce myself. He held up his badge slightly, ensuring everyone in the room had a clear view. I'm Ethan Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The judge stiffened, his hand pausing over the papers he was processing. His face paled as Ethan's words registered. The remaining onlookers watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. I was late this morning due to an urgent federal case that required my immediate attention, Ethan continued, his tone firm yet respectful, and while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Robinson, if you feel there are procedural issues, you can file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting this morning's events, Ethan replied, holding up his notebook, not just my treatment but the varying responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson? I'm stating what I've observed, Your Honor, Ethan said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied fairly, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Ethan and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was scribbling furiously, her eyes wide with intrigue. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters very seriously. If you believe there's an error in judgment, I suggest you address it through the appropriate channels. Ethan placed his badge and credentials on the bench. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity to reflect on how we ensure the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, his authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. You may go, Mr. Robinson, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Ethan collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not without delivering a final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I will ensure this is addressed properly. As Ethan exited the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of the remaining onlookers on his back. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about challenging a system that too often failed to see its own flaws. Outside, Ethan pulled out his phone and began composing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. As he pressed send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email Ethan sent that afternoon spread faster than he anticipated. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. His supervisor, Eleanor Harper, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a mix of urgency and curiosity. Ethan, I've read your report, she said. If what you've described is accurate, this isn't just a singular incident. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Ethan replied. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Eleanor let out a sharp sigh. I'll be contacting the Judicial Review Committee. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as possible. If this goes public, we need to be prepared. The call ended, but Ethan's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the city court session. He scoured public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and sentences handed down by Judge Whitman. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor offenses were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced sentences. Ethan reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of disparate treatment flooded in. Some whispered in confidence, others came forward with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being heavily fined for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple infractions received only a minor fee. Another described how the judge routinely interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. Within days, the Judicial Review Committee launched a formal investigation. Investigators descended on the courthouse, demanding case files spanning years and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Ms. Thompson, turned out to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she produced a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are notes I've been keeping," she confessed. "Every time something didn't seem right, I wrote it down. I was too afraid to say anything, but I couldn't ignore it anymore." The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. The investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the courtroom's longtime bailiff. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. "I've been here for 15 years, Wilson said. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to spread in the local community. The young law student who had witnessed the courtroom exchange posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. Newspaper headlines followed soon after: "Bias in Greenville Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct." News outlets picked up the story, and Ethan found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came non-stop, but he chose to focus on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors swirled that he had been called into numerous closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately, he began to grasp the gravity of the situation. By the first weekend, Ethan received a call from Eleanor. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie, Ethan. Black defendants in his courtroom are fined 3 times as often as white defendants for the same offenses. It's systemic." "What's the next step?" Ethan asked. "We're taking this to the state judicial board, and Ethan, the media won't let this go. Brace yourself." Ethan nodded to himself, even as a wave of exhaustion washed over him. This was bigger than he imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The story of Ethan's encounter with Judge Whitman had spread beyond Greenville. By the second weekend, national news outlets were covering the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Exposed, Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand" dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags like #EqualJusticeNo and #BiasInTheCourts trended for days, with thousands sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Ethan remained focused, working with the Judicial Review Committee to solidify the evidence. The findings were damning. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. White latecomers were often let off with a warning, while black defendants faced reprimands or hefty fines. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistics, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, some anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. Local activist groups joined the fray, organizing protests and calling for accountability outside the Greenville courthouse. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice must be blind" and "End bias now." Ethan stayed out of the public spectacle as much as possible, but he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding. Inside the courthouse, the pressure mounted. Staff members who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began sharing their own observations. Ms. Thompson, the court clerk, became a key figure in the investigation. Her detailed notes, combined with court records, painted a comprehensive picture of decades-long bias. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said in an interview with investigators, "but now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even James Wilson, the bailiff, spoke out publicly. In a statement to the committee, he said, "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long overdue to do something about it." Meanwhile, Judge Whitman found himself increasingly isolated. Though he initially dismissed the allegations as misunderstandings, the mounting evidence forced him into damage control. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that might have caused harm. The words rang hollow. Faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Ethan, though besieged by attention, held his ground. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor, knowing his responsibilities extended beyond this case. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the messages flooding his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters arrived from across the country, some offering support, others sharing similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement spread beyond Greenville. Other judges in South Carolina faced scrutiny as activists and reporters began digging into court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a sweeping review of city courts, vowing to root out systemic bias. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Committee completed its preliminary report. The findings were damning, and the implications were clear. Judge Whitman's actions were part of a larger, deeply ingrained problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight boards. The pressure became too much for Judge Whitman. Faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe my resignation is in the best interest of this court and this community." The statement was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a necessary step toward healing. For Ethan, it was a moment of vindication, but not celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead. As the reforms began to take shape, Ethan found himself in a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experiences and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story inspired young lawyers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, to see themselves as agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Ethan after his speech. "You showed me that law isn't just about rules, it's about people. You gave me a reason to fight for justice." Ethan smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning, but if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that started it all, the courthouse in Greenville looked markedly different. The old beige walls had been repainted, and a new reception desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they never knew existed: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but significant plaque had been installed near the entrance: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courtroom, the changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman no longer presided, having quietly left the bench after his resignation. In his place, a younger judge, known for fairness and impartiality, had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms had begun to take hold. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training sessions, led by experts who addressed the subtle ways discrimination could creep into decision-making. Ethan stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and attorneys about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited his turn, he felt a mix of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms had spread beyond Greenville. Inspired by Ethan's actions, other communities in South Carolina, and eventually across the country, began to reevaluate their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, paying particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees comprised of legal experts, community activists, and former defendants were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Ethan's office, the motivation was clear. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on the wall, not as a trophy but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Beneath it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had formed a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. In the community, the ripple effects were equally significant. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had worked under Judge Whitman, now led bias training sessions for court personnel. In one of his sessions, he addressed a room full of new recruits. "Our job isn't just to keep order, it's to ensure everyone who walks into this room is treated with respect. If you see something wrong, you have to speak up. Silence is complicity." Ms. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been pivotal in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly to mentor younger clerks and ensure the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Ethan's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with reform ideas. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Ethan paused for a moment before answering. "Listen to each other, listen to those who come before our courts and those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The changes were not without resistance. Some judges and attorneys pushed back against the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences at the Greenville City Court. Payment plans were approved more frequently, and defendants reported feeling more respected. The most rewarding moments for Ethan came from those who approached him to share their stories. An elderly black man, who had been present in the courtroom that morning months ago, returned to the courthouse to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day someone finally said, 'Enough.' Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Ethan received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and was inspired to start her own investigation into bias in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line: "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Ethan read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled "Impact." He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long, voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Ethan walked back into the courthouse where it all began. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the dedication of a new judicial ethics center, named in part for his efforts. As he stepped onto the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Ethan began. It's about how we treat those who come before our courts. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect, and it's about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they are, knows they matter. The applause thundered, but Ethan's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginning of real change, and he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction. Kendrick dared to stand up for justice, even when faced with power. What do you think of how he handled this situation? If you were in a similar situation, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can inspire many. Have you ever witnessed injustice or had to fight for what's right? Share your story so we can discuss it together. If this story resonated with you, send it to your friends and loved ones to spread the message of justice and equality. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more meaningful stories. Every small action of ours can make a big difference. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individuals or organizations. They are shared for the purpose of promoting humane values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.